Having a strong understanding of the rules for amphibious assaults and Axis and allies is truly one of the biggest keys to victory. In this video, we're going to break them down so that you'll be ready to storm the beaches and crush your enemies. Let's make it hot. Welcome to Board Game Nation. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching. Today we're wrapping up our 5-part series that breaks down sea combat for Axis and allies. In part 1, we took a detailed look at the rules for submarines and destroyers. Part 2 was all about aircraft carriers. Part 3, we broke down the rules for transports. And in part 4, cruisers and battleships. If you want to take a look at those, we'll have a link to those at the end of this video. Today we're bringing everything together from this series in a video dedicated specifically to amphibious assaults. One quick thing, if you're brand new to Axis and Allies, this video is not for you. You need to head over to our complete how to play video linked in the card above. It'll take you through the game from top to bottom, or you can jump around using the chapter guide in the description. This video series is for folks that are looking for rules clarifications and examples specifically about sea combat. Overall, we'll be focusing on 1942 2nd edition, but thankfully, the rules for sea combat haven't changed that much since the original came out back in 1984. So about 94.6% of the series is going to transfer to other versions of the game. If you like anything having to do with board games, and well, you clicked on this video, so I'm guessing the answer to that question is yes, please support content like this by subscribing to the channel. Thanks. Let's start with the definition. Any attack that involves a transport moving land units into a hostile land territory is an amphibious assault. It can be 1 unit attacking or 20. The territory could be defended to the gills or free for the taking. No matter the circumstances, amphibious assaults break into 3 main steps: sea combat, offshore bombardment, and land combat. Sea combat involves moving attacking sea units into a sea zone that is hostile with the goal of landing troops in an adjacent land territory. Offshore bombardments utilize the special ability of cruisers and battleships that soften the ground for the land units. And lastly, land combat. Land units are offloaded from transports into a hostile territory where they'll do battle. Let's talk about the sea combat that would precede troops being offloaded. Here's the crux of it. During an amphibious assault, attackers can only offload troops into a hostile territory from a sea zone that is friendly. So if enemy units stand between the transport and the beaches of that hostile land territory, the attackers must use their sea and/or air units to clear that sea zone first and make a path for those transports. This doesn't necessarily mean that all the enemy units have to be destroyed. Ignored enemy subs and transports may be in the zone without escorting surface warships that don't make the sea zone hostile. There is an odd chestnut of the rules that puts an asterisk next to that last bit, but we'll get back to that later. Also, if you've got questions about how transports load or offload, here's a link to the video that we did that explains transports in more detail. Go check it out. Next, we have offshore bombardment. In this stage, cruisers and battleships that were not involved in any sea combat get to use their special ability to fire the cannons at the defending units. Once the transports offload into the hostile territory, that's when the land combat begins. Time for an example. Let's take a look at the Germans trying to attack the United Kingdom in Egypt. Adding a cruiser for the Germans gives them the ability to use the offshore bombardment ability during the attack on Egypt. The transport loads the infantry in Algeria, moving to 15, loads a tank from Italy, offloads them in Egypt to fight with the other land units, but this time we add the cruiser. Offshore bombardments are basically a free shot that cruisers and battleships get to take before combat begins. Cruisers will score a hit on a 3 and battleships on a 4 as normal, and any hits that are scored are selected by the defense and moved to the casualty zone. But those units will get to shoot back during the defender's fire phase of combat. If you played earlier versions of this game, that last bit was a change in the rules. Let's see how this combat plays out on a battle board. The cruiser hits at a 3, so we placed it in that lane. The cruiser fires first, needing a 3, a hit. The defenders move 1 infantry to the casualty zone. The 2 infantry units need a 1, both miss, and the tanks need a 3 or less. Both hit. The UK moves the 2nd infantry and the fighter to the casualty zone. The cruiser can't be hit during the defender fire phase, so we move it back to the map. Both infantry get to fire back. 1 hit. The fighter needing a 4 or less, 1 more hit. The Germans remove 2 infantry. The British remove their casualties. The Germans take control of the territory and adjust the national production chart. A couple of notes. The number of ships that can perform offshore bombardments is limited to the number of land units being offloaded from the same sea zones as the ship doing the firing. So you can't just buy 10 cruisers and drop off 1 guy and fire all the cannons. This also means that the ships can't do offshore bombardments if they aren't dropping any troops off at all. Plus, you can't have the transports dropping troops off in a sea zone and performing an offshore bombardment from a different sea zone. They've got to be moving together. And most importantly, offshore bombardments are impossible if the ship is involved in any sea combat. Let's see what that looks like. In the combat move, the Germans declared a land attack on Egypt with units coming by land and by sea. You can see that Sea Zone 17 has 2 British destroyers. The Germans will have to clear this sea zone before they can land on the beach. They place markers in both areas. The cruiser moves to Sea Zone 17. The transport picks up an infantry in Algeria and moves to Sea Zone 15, picks up a tank, and then moves into 17. The infantry in Libya walks over, and the tank from Algeria moves in. No matter what happens in the combat in Sea Zone 17 or in the battle in Egypt, the cruiser will not be able to use its offshore bombardment ability because it will have done combat in Sea Zone 17. Now that all the combat orders have been issued, we move into the conduct combat phase. First, we've got to resolve that sea combat. We're going to look at 3 possible outcomes for that sea battle: the good, the bad, and the ugly. We'll start with the ugly. Back to the battle board. Just the cruiser versus 2 destroyers. No subs this time. The attackers fire and miss. The defending units fire and get 2 hits. The Germans must now assign both hits. The first has to go to the cruiser and the second must be assigned to the transport. Both ships and the cargo of the transport go down to the depths. The British destroyers do a little dance. Let's look at a second way that that battle can end. This time, the bad. Adding a fighter and a bomber to southern Europe should help even the odds. The Germans perform all the same combat moves, but they add the fighter to the sea battle in Sea Zone 17 and the bomber to the land combat in Egypt. Let's go to the battle board and see how this goes. The attackers fire, 1 hit. The defenders move a destroyer to the casualty zone. Both fire back, 2 hits. The attackers remove the fire and the cruiser from play. 1 destroyer down and 1 remains. The Germans are in a bad spot here. If they press the attack, the transport and the units on it will be destroyed automatically because they have no attack capabilities. So, naturally, they choose to retreat. The transport moves back to Sea Zone 15 and ends its turn there. To make matters worse, the transport cannot unload. It's been in combat, its move is over. Again, all bad for the Germans. It's worth noting here that the land units in the combat have to do at least 1 round of combat before they can retreat. The loss or retreat from a sea combat doesn't undo the combat moves of the land or the air unit. They must attack and allow the defenders to fire back. Okay, let's reset one more time and look at another way that this can play out. This time we'll use all the same combat moves, but the dice will finally show the Germans some good outcome. Back to the board. The attackers fire, 2 hits. The defenders move both destroyers to the casualty zone. They fire back, and they get 2 hits. The attackers remove the fighter and the cruiser from play. The destroyers go back to the box. This time there's no defending units remaining. The sea zone is clear and the units move on to the beach. Now, the seaborne German units would move into the land combat and resolve as we previously described. In this video, we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about how land combat plays out. Suffice it to say that the rules are the same for units that are attacking over land as they are for units attacking from the sea, with one big exception. Land units attacking a hostile territory that are offloaded from transports cannot retreat. If the battle goes sideways, they can't swim back to the ships, and they can't join any land units that attack from other land territories on the run. If you commit land units from the sea, for those units, it's do or die. Because of this, when you're attacking a territory and you've got units that are coming from the land and others from sea, you'll need to keep them separate on the battle board. If everything goes bad and you decide to retreat, you need to know which units can run and which have to be left behind. Remember, air units, regardless of where they came from, can retreat, which means that if you sound the retreat, air units can remove themselves from combat and then wait for the non-combat phase to find some place friendly to land. Let's look at a quick example of how that might play out. The US wants to attack the Japanese units in French Indochina. They have units in Yunnan and the Philippines. During the combat move phase, the US loads a tank and an infantry onto a transport in 48 and moves into attack. It's joined by a battleship. They also move 2 tanks and 2 infantry in from Yunnan. The US fighters on the British carrier take off from 35 and join the attack. French Indochina Thailand is defended by 6 infantry, 2 tanks, and 1 AA gun. Sea Zone 36 is friendly, so no sea combat is required, and the battleship will be able to use its offshore bombardment. Let's go to the battle board. Notice that we've separated the infantry and the tank that was offloaded from the transport. First up to fire, the American battleship. It needs a 4 or less. A miss. Now, the Japanese AA gun will roll 2 dice, 1 for each attacking air unit, looking for a 1 to hit, and 1 hit. One of the fighters is removed from the board and will not get to fire. Not a great start for the US. The Americans fire with the 3 infantry at a 1, no hits. The tank and the fighter at a 3 or less, 1 hit. Oh boy. Japan takes the 1 hit on the AA gun and moves it to the casualty zone. The 6th infantry return fire, 2 hits. The tanks, 1 more hit. The Americans remove all 3 infantry. Now the Americans have to choose to stay and fight or retreat. They choose to retreat. Bad news for the last American tank that came in from the Philippines. Everyone else can retreat, but because the tank came from a transport, it must stay and fight. The other land units retreat to Yunnan, and the fighter is out of combat and waiting for the non-combat move phase. We move the retreating units back to the map, and the tank stands alone as combat continues. Back to step 3. The tank fires and a hit. The Japanese move an infantry to the casualty zone. The infantry fires back and makes the tank wish it had stayed home. It heads back to the box. Getting everything back on the map for the non-combat move phase, we can see that the retreated American units are back in Yunnan and the fighter needs to find a place to land. It'll move back to the carrier in 35. Let's look at one more example that puts a few of these concepts together, this time in Paris. In this example, we have the UK getting ready to invade France. They have 1 transport, a battleship, and 2 cruisers in C-Zone 15. C-Zone 14 has a German transport. The UK can attack the transport in 14, or they can ignore it. If they choose to attack it, the cruiser and the battleship won't be able to use their offshore bombardment abilities in the attack on France. If they ignore it, when they land the troops, they can fire away. The UK also has a battleship in C-Zone 6, but because it can't reach the same C-Zone as any of the transports that are offloading, they won't be involved in the attack on France and are free to do combat elsewhere. The UK already has possession of northwestern Europe and plans to attack France over land. This will not affect any of the abilities of any of the ships at sea in any way. So in this case, the UK picks up the infantry and the tank in Libya, moves into C-Zone 14 with a battleship and 1 of the cruisers, and ignores the transport. Notice that the UK had 3 ships that could have reached the southern beaches of France and performed an offshore bombardment, but they only dropped off 2 land units. This means that the UK will only be able to fire from 2 of the 3 ships. The other cruiser is not involved in the attack on France. It can be assigned to do combat elsewhere, say attacking the German destroyer in C-Zone 13, along with the battleship coming in from C-Zone 6. However, the last cruiser from 15 can't attack the transport in 14. That would drag all the other ships into combat and stop the offshore bombardments. The UK drops the tank and the infantry and meets up with the 2 infantry and the 2 artillery that came in from northwestern Europe. The cruiser and their battleship will both fire once, and the rest of the combat will continue as we described earlier. Now back to that odd rule regarding subs and amphibious assaults. Subs by themselves do not create hostile sea zones. If you've got questions about that, here's a link to part 1 of the series. So transports can't ignore them. They can load or offload troops as if they weren't there, except if the transport is moving alone and is engaged in amphibious assault. Let's just go to the map. Here's how it works. Japan wants to attack Honolulu. Normally, Japan would be able to ignore the American sub and do whatever they wanted, but here's where that odd rule comes into play. The transport cannot get through C-Zone 53 and attack Hawaii without help. It could ignore the sub and move through to C-Zone 54 or 56, or even end its turn in 53 with the sub, but it can't initiate an amphibious assault if an enemy sub is present without an escort. So if the Japanese move any sea units into 53, they can attack the sub or they can ignore it, and the transport can offload into Hawaii. We hope you found this series helpful. We're currently working on a series that'll focus on air units and air combat. When that's ready, you can find it at BoardGameNation.com or right here. If you'd like to go back and look at the other parts of the Sea Combat series, here's your link. If you'd like to see the entire How to Play for Axis and Allies, here you go. And if you're ready to join Board Game Nation, click here to subscribe. My name is Gary Blevins. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.